We have a couple of really interesting stories for you tonight from Stories of God by Rilke. And I have been so much enjoying these stories and spending time with you in this virtual way. I'm happy to maybe tell you a story and brighten your day a little bit. Our first story is called The Song of Justice. The next time I passed Ewald's window, he waved to me and smiled. "Did you promise the children something definite?" "How so?" I asked in surprise. Well, when I had told them the story of Yegor, they complained that God did not come into it. I was startled. What? A story without God? But how is that possible? Then I remembered. Indeed, it is true. That story, as I now think it over, says nothing about God. I can't understand how that could happen. Had someone asked me for a story, I believe I should have thought all my life in vain. My friend smiled at this agitation. You must not take it to heart, he interrupted with a certain kindliness. I imagine one can never tell whether God is in a story before one has finished it completely. For if only 2 words of the telling are still missing, indeed, if nothing but the pause after the last word is still outstanding, he may yet come. I nodded, and the lame man went on in a different tone. Don't you know something more about those Russian singers? I demurred. Yes, but we should not rather talk about God, Ewald? He shook his head. I want so much to hear more about those singular men. I don't know how it happens. I always imagine if one of them were to come in here, and he turned his head toward the room in the direction of the door. Then his eyes came back to me quickly, and not without embarrassment. But of course that would hardly be possible, he amended hastily. Why should it not be possible, Ewald? Many things might come to you that are not vouchsafed to people who can use their legs, because they pass so much by and run away from so many things. God has destined you, Ewald, to be a calm point amidst all the hurry. Don't you feel how everything moves around you? Other people are always chasing after their days, and when they do catch up with one, they are so out of breath that they cannot talk with it at all. But you, my friend, simply sit at your window and wait. And to those who wait, something always happens. You have a quite particular destiny. Just think, even the Iberian Madonna in Moscow must leave her little shrine, and she drives in a black coach with 4 horses to those who are celebrating something, be it a christening or a death. But to you, everything must come. Yes, said Ewald with a remote simile. I cannot even go to meet death. Many people find him as they go in their ways. He fights shy of entering their houses and calls them away to foreign lands, to war, up onto a high tower, onto a swaying bridge, into some bewilderment or into madness. Most of them at least fetch him from somewhere outside and then carry him home on their shoulders all unwittingly. For death is lazy. If people were not always disturbing him, who knows, he might even fall asleep. The sick man pondered for a while, and then continued with a certain pride. But to me, he will have to come when he wants me, here into my sunny little room, where the flowers keep fresh so long, over this old carpet, past this cupboard, between the table and the foot of the bed. It's not so easy to squeeze through. right here to my dear old comfortable chair, which will then probably die with me because it has, so to speak, lived with me. And he will have to do all of this in the usual way, like any visitor, without noise, without knocking anything over, without doing anything out of the ordinary. That is what brings my room extraordinarily close to me. It will all be acted out on this narrow stage, and that is why this last episode will not differ so very much from all the other events that have taken place here and are yet to come. Even when I was a child, it always seemed strange to me that people should speak so differently of death from the way they speak of other incidents, and that only because nobody divulges to us what happens to him afterwards. But how then is a dead man to be distinguished from a person who turns serious, renounces time, and locks himself in order to reflect quietly about something, the solution of which has long been worrying him? Among people, one can't even remember the Lord's Prayer. How then remember some other more mysterious context that may consist not of words, but events? One must go apart into some inaccessible stillness, and perhaps the dead are such as have withdrawn in order to reflect upon life. There ensued a brief silence, to which I put an end with the following words. That makes me think of a certain young girl. One might say that she spent the first 17 years of her happy life entirely in looking. Her eyes were so large and so self-reliant that they themselves consumed all that they received, and the life in the young creature's whole body went on independently of them, nourished by its own smooth inner stirrings. At the end of that time, however, some too violent event disturbed this double life, whose courses scarcely touched. The eyes seemed to break through, back into her inner being, and the whole weight of the outside fell through them into her dark heart, and each new day plunged so heavily into that deep, steep-down gaze that it burst like a glass in her slender breast. Then the young girl grew pale, began to sicken, to be much alone, to meditate, and in the end, herself sought that stillness in which thoughts are probably no longer disturbed. How did she die? Asked my friend softly, his voice slightly husky. She was drowned in a deep, still pool, and on the surface of it, many circles formed, slowly widening and growing away under the white water lilies, so that all those bathing blossoms stirred. Is that a story, too? Asked Ewald, to keep the silence behind my words from taking over. No, I answered, it is a feeling and emotion. But couldn't one convey it to the children, too, that emotion? I pondered. Perhaps. And how? By another story. And I began. It was at the time when they were fighting for freedom in southern Russia. Forgive me, interrupted Ewald. How am I to understand that? Did the people want to get rid of the Tsar? That wouldn't correspond with my idea of Russia, and that would be inconsistent with what you have told me before. If that is the case, I would prefer not to hear your story, for I love the picture that I have made for myself of things there and want to keep it unspoiled. That made me smile, and I reassured him. The Polish pans, I should have said that in the beginning, were masters in southern Russia and in those silent, solitary steppes that are known as the Ukraine. They were hard masters. Their tyranny and the cupidity of the Jews, who even held the keys of the church and would only let the true believers have them for money, had made the young people about Kiev and all the way up the Dnieper weary and thoughtful. The city itself, Kiev, the holy, the place where Russia first gave account of herself, with 400 church domes, sank always more into itself and consumed itself in fires, as if in sudden lunatic thoughts, behind which the night only grows more and more immense. The people of the steppe did not rightly know what was happening, but seized with singular unrest, the old men would leave their huts at night and gaze silently into the high, eternally windless heavens, and gaze silent, and by day one could see figures appear on the ridges of the kurgans and stand waiting, silhouetted against the flat distance. These kurgans are burial mounds of bygone generations and spread across the entire plain like a frozen, sleeping succession of waves. And in this country, where graves are the mountains, men are the abysses. Deep, dark, silent are these people, and their words are but weak, swaying bridges over their real being. Sometimes dark birds fly up from the kurgans. Sometimes wild songs drop down into these crepuscular people and vanish deep inside them, while the birds are lost in the sky. In all directions, everything seems limitless. Even the houses are no protection against this immeasurableness. Their little windows are full of it. Only in the darkening corners of the rooms the old icons stand, like milestones of God, and the glint of a tiny light runs over their frames like a lost child through the starry night. These icons are the only hold, the only reliable sign on the way, and no house can endure without them. More are needed all the time, when one goes to pieces with age and worms, or when somebody marries and builds himself a hut, or when a person like old Abraham, for instance, dies with the wish to take St. Nicholas, the worker of miracles, with him in his folded hands, probably in order to compare the saints in heaven with the image and to recognize this especially honored one before all the others. So it comes that Peter Akimovich, properly a shoemaker by profession, also paints icons. When he tires of the one labor, he changes, after he has crossed himself 3 times, to the other, and over his sewing and hammering, as well as his painting, the same piety holds sway. He is already an old man now, but quite robust. His back, when he bends over the boots, he straightens up again before the pictures, and thus he has preserved a good posture and a certain equilibrium in shoulders and loins. The greater part of his life he has spent all alone, never mingling in the excitement which came of his wife Akulina bearing him children of these dying or getting married. Not till his 70th year had Peter gotten into touch with those who had been dwelling in his house and whom he now for the first time looked upon as really present. These were Akulina, his wife, a quiet, humble person who had spent herself almost wholly in her children, an aging, ugly daughter, and Ilosha, a son, who, born disproportionately late in his father's life, was only 17. This son, Peter, wanted to train in painting, for he realized that he alone would not be able to cope much longer with all the orders. But he soon abandoned the lessons. Iolosha had painted the most holy Virgin, but had so little achieved the austere and correct image he was copying that his handiwork looked like a portrait of Mariana, the daughter of Golokopetiko, the Cossack. That is, like something thoroughly sinful. And old Peter hastened, after crossing himself many times, to paint over the offended panel with a Saint Dimitri, for whom some unknown reason he set above other saints. Nor did Iolosha ever again try to begin a picture. When his father had not ordered him to gild a halo, he was usually out on the steppe, no one knew where. Nobody kept him at home. His mother wondered about him and was shy of speaking to him as though he were a stranger or an official. His sister had always beaten him when he was a child, and now that Iolosha had grown up, she began to despise him because he did not beat her. Neither was there anybody in the village who bothered about the boy. Mariana, the Cossack's daughter, had laughed at him when he told her he wanted to marry her, and therefore Iolosha had not asked the other girls if they would accept him as a bridegroom. Nobody wanted to take him into the Sech to the Zaporozhian Cossacks because they all thought him too weakly and perhaps also a little young yet. Once he had run away to the nearest monastery, but the monks did not take him in, and so only the plain remained to him, the broad, billowing plain. A hunter had once given him an old gun, loaded with God knows what. Iolosha always dragged it about with him, but never fired it. First, because he wanted to save the bullet, and then because he did not know what to shoot. One warm, quiet evening at the beginning of summer, they all sat together at the rough-hewn table, on which stood a dish of meal. Peter ate, and the others watched him and waited for what he should leave. Suddenly the old man stopped with his spoon in mid-air and stretched his broad, wrinkled head into the streak of light that came from the doorway and ran straight across the table into the dusk behind. They all listened. Outside, along the walls of the hut, there was a sound as though some night bird were gently brushing against the beams with its wings. But the sun had scarcely set, and anyway, nocturnal birds rarely ventured into the village. And then again, it seemed as though some other large animal were tapping its way round the house, and as though its groping tread were perceptible from all the walls at once. Iolosha rose quietly from his bench. At the same moment, the door was darkened by something high, black. It pushed the whole evening aside, brought night into the hut, and could only move forward unsteadily in its great bulk. "Ostap," said the ugly girl in her harsh voice, and now they all recognized him. It was one of the blind Kobzars, an old man who wandered through the villages with a 12-string bandura and sang of the great fame of the Cossacks, of their braveness and loyalty, of their hetmans, Kindaria, Kukubenko, Buha, and other heroes, so that everyone loved to listen. Ostap bowed 3 times in the direction in which he guessed the holy image to be, and it was Zamenietza to whom he thus instinctively turned, sat down near the stove and asked in a low voice, "In whose house may I be?" "In ours, little father, in the house of Peter Akimovich, the shoemaker, answered Peter affably. He was a lover of song and glad of this unexpected visit. Ah, Peter Akimovich, the one who paints icons, said the blind man, returning the courtesy. Then there was silence. In the long 6 strings of the bandura, a sound began, grew, and came back brittle, and as if exhausted from the 6 short strings, and this effect kept reoccurring in ever-quickening measure, so that finally one had to close one's eyes for fear of seeing the tone hurtle down from some height to which the melody had mounted in such a delirious onrush. Then the instrument broke off and gave way to the fine, strong voice of the Kobzar, which soon filled the whole house and called the people out of the neighboring huts too, who gathered before the door and underneath the windows. But not of the heroes did the song tell this time. The fame of Bulba and Astroneza and Navalinko seemed already secure. Firm for all time seemed the faith of the Cossacks. Not of their deeds did the song tell that day. The spirit of the dance seemed to sleep deeper in all who heard, for no one moved a leg or raised a hand. Like Ostap's head, so were the other heads bowed, growing heavy with the sorrowful song. There is no justice more in the world. Justice, who can find her? There is no justice more in the world, for all justice has become subject to the laws of injustice. Today justice lies wretched in chains, and wrong laughs at her. We have seen it, and sits with the pans in their golden seats, and sits in the golden hall with the pans. Justice lies on the threshold imploring. Wrong, which is evil, is the guest of the pans, who beckon it laughing into their palace, and they pour wrong a cup full of mead. O justice, little mother mine, with a wing that is like to the eagle's, there may yet come a man who wants to be just, then help him, God. He alone can and make light the days of the just. And only with effort were the heads lifted, and on all brows stood silence. This they too saw who would have spoken. And after a short, solemn pause, the playing on the bandura began again, this time already better understood by the ever-growing crowd. 3 times Ostap sang his song of justice, and each time it was a different song. If the first time it was a lament, upon repetition it seemed a reproach. And finally, when at the 3rd time the Kobzar was, with high-thrown head, shouted it like a chain of curt commands, a wild fury broke from the quivering words and took possession of the listeners and carried them all away in a spreading yet anxious enthusiasm. "Where do the men meet?" asked a young peasant as the singer arose. The old man, who was informed of all the movements of the Cossacks, named a place nearby. The men dispersed rapidly. Sharp calls were heard, the stir of arms, and women wept in the doorways. An hour later, a company of peasants, armed, marched out of the village toward Chernigov. Peter had offered the Kobzar a glass of cider in the hope of learning more from him. The old man sat and drank, but gave only brief replies to the shoemaker's many questions. Then he thanked his host and went. Alosha led the blind man over the threshold. When they were out in the night and alone, Alosha asked beseechingly, "And may everybody go to war?" "Everybody," said the old man, and vanished with quickened stride, as though the night would lend him vision. When all were asleep, Alosha rose from the stove, where he had been lying in his clothes, took his gun, and went forth. Outside, he felt himself suddenly embraced and gently kissed on the hair. Next moment, he recognized Akolina in the moonlight, tripping hastily toward the house. "Mother," he explained, and a strange feeling came over him. He hesitated a while. A door opened and closed somewhere, and a dog howled nearby. Then Alosha slung his gun over his shoulder and strode stoutly away, for he thought to catch up with the men before morning. In the house, they all acted as though they did not notice Alosha's absence. Only when they sat down to table once more and Peter became aware of the empty place, he got up again, went into the corner and lit a candle before Jamanesia, a very thin candle. The ugly girl shrugged her shoulders. Meanwhile, Ostap, the blind old man, was already on his way through the next village, beginning sadly and with gently lamenting voice the song of justice. The lame man waited yet a while. Then he looked at me in surprise. "Well, why don't you finish? It is the same as isn't the story about trees and the old man was God." "Oh, and I didn't know," said I, tingling at the thought. And that's the end of that story. He writes in riddles. The Song of Justice. While I was reading that, I was thinking, there doesn't seem to be a lot of justice going on right now. But the 3 times that he repeated the same song, finally it was a call to arms, wasn't it? Anyway, if that was God, my, I have to think about this. Good night. Don't think too hard. Rest well.